Yeah, when I first read that number of 150 some time ago, I thought, yeah, I mean that seems really reasonable. In fact, I think we should be doing more, right? I also talked to when I was talking to some of the folks at some of the shelters. You'd ask how many people are experiencing homeless, need a house, and the number was in the thousands. And so we look at the bigger challenge that of how many people need this type of housing, and we're looking at the stock of housing, that we have existing right now. Is it there? Is it can we build this amount of housing fast enough? And I think we can. We can. We just need to put our mind to it. And since that point, I've really started to talk to a lot of organizations, associations that are focused on nonprofit housing. Low-income housing. So we was just working with somebody from the Harriet Street Housing, looking at how the struggles that they're going through right now to provide low-income housing for seniors on a perfectly good lot, empty surface lot that's been there forever. It's actually in my neighborhood, right over, not too far from this building actually. Mm-hmm. And the process takes forever to get this done. And one of the steps that was a big hurdle was a variance that needed to be overcome because of parking minimums and a number of other things that make it really hard to create housing on a smaller scale. Most private developers these days, they're going to be looking at the costs of building, what the profits are available to building. And that's why I think when they look at those things without any other incentive, to build lower income housing, it's just off the table for them because it's not cost effective. And so if we want developers to be building this, first of all, private developers, we need to figure out ways of either incentivizing them or mandating that these, at least maybe a floor or some units per floor are built. They can be smaller units, but it just needs to happen. One other thing I was early on in the campaign, policy statement that I brought out, which was really important to me from my work that I've done here in the West End, was just on vacant houses. So my thought on these is, and I watched and documented over the last 5 years, many of the houses getting boarded up. They would maybe get broken into, and then they would get burnt down. So they're not being used for housing. They're an eyesore. They're not a safe space. And so I wanted to implement a tax on those houses if they're boarded up. And currently, right now, the city does charge a fee, but it takes way too long for that fee to be implemented. And so I'd like to speed it up to 6 months. If it's boarded up for 6 months, let's start charging the fee, and instead of 1%, let's double it to 2% of the assessed property value. On a $250,000 house, it would bring in roughly $5,000 a year. That's actually a significant hit to a person who's just sitting on a property and not doing anything with it. At $2,500, at 1%, it's not that big of a hit, and somebody who owns multiple properties can afford to just assume that for a certain period of time. We have way too many of these houses, so we need to be more strict on them so that they are turned over, they're sold to somebody who will create affordable housing, whether it's another private landlord or not-for-profit housing. That's an option for sure. I think there's definitely things we can do to reduce the bus fare. Still, I know that there is lower income fare rates that you can apply for. I think we need to make that easier because I don't, at this point, I don't necessarily support a full 80% cut that some folks are discussing. Yeah, I would love to see that, but I do think that, if we're gonna go that low, can we make it free for some people? That's kind of where I would look at that point. Mm-hmm. So definitely not off the table at all. But when I started first thinking about this, the first thing I said is, well, okay, if I'm trying to apply for a low income pass or a low income fare, it's how easy is this for me to do? And just navigating the city's website, it's not that easy. Mm-hmm. That's one thing I've thought many times as I've spent the last 4 or 5 years learning about the city, just navigating the city's website. If it's hard for me, well, especially for somebody who's going to come into the city as a newcomer, maybe doesn't understand English as the first language, how do we make that way easier as well? So currently, I don't support it in actual text. So I, like anybody else, knows that there's a major imbalance when you look at the budget. And I would do this in business all the time. I would look at certain departments and say, like, is one department way, out of line with the other departments, and how much money we're spending, on that department. And currently a large amount of the budget for the police service is wrapped up in wages and salaries and benefits, and that is tied into contract agreements and collective bargaining agreements as well. And so it would be a really difficult thing to change immediately. However, I think that going forward, we need to say as a city, like, what level of spending are we happy with? What level of spending can we afford? And and I look at this as an overall system here, because I will look at the system and say at some point we need to, like, balance out these departments so that we're not feeling like we're spending way too much money on police services and way too little money on recreational services, or some of the other things that are actually really good at keeping kids off the streets, people off the streets, and that kind of stuff. So at this moment, I've said I would freeze the police budget, because I need to look at the books, and I need to get into a deeper dive on that. We think that the rest of the budget is hard to understand. The police budget is hard to understand too, because it's also working with a board. Council has the ability to adjust that budget. There is no question that we could do that, and I think I would have to start to take a little bit of a long-term strategy on this and look at the collective bargaining agreements as well, and make sure that we are spending an appropriate amount of money, going forward, and so that we're not lopsided. I want to just talk about the social services side of things, because this is something I brought up in my second policy statement when I was talking about police. I think it really is important that, in order to look at adjusting, the amount of money spent on actual policing, we do need to look at some of the things that police are currently doing right now, and seeing if we could get them to not do it, right? And that would allow us to look at saying, okay, how can we now sort of shift some of that money around? And there are a couple of things that they have been working on right now. They have I'm gonna.
ARC.
Yes, thank you. I know it was ARC, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna get the actual words wrong at this moment, but the active response, alternative response to citizens in crisis. Thank you very much. And I like that idea, and I think the problem with the pilot program is, just like our strategies that we come up, we just haven't funded it enough to actually get a good idea. Is this actually going to work? So this is a plainclothes police officer partnered with, a social worker, and who meets people in a different way than if you're showing up in a uniform. Right? We have mobile crisis units. I think those can be expanded as well, so that maybe police aren't the first people who have to show up at a situation where somebody is experiencing mental health crisis or addictions. And that's where I think the downtown community safety patrol comes in really well too, because they've started to take on that role, and they've also changed their uniforms so that they're not uniformed. We for sure need to look at all of the community organizations and that are working together to put eyes on the street, to help people on the street, Bear Clan, and all of the other groups that are. When I was working with Central Neighborhoods, we funded a couple of different community patrols, and they're doing great work. And that's the type of stuff that police don't need to do necessarily first. We look at wellness checks. So those kinds of things can be done possibly by ARC, or possibly even cadets too, to reduce the workload. One of the other things that I looked at, because it's it does take a lot of resources is when the police are in hospitals. So hospital time could be an entire shift for 2 police officers, right? And so what that does is that it means that we have lower response time for other things because the police are in the hospitals. So I would like to look at different ways of solving that with, potentially even cadets who can take on those roles, and that would have to be expanding their role would have to be worked out in the agreements. But I think that there is more that we can do with cadets to allow police to just focus more on policing and not the social services side of that. Yeah.
So the ARC program is something that we actually so we're part of the Police Accountability Coalition. We have issues with it because it is still a police first response.
Right, okay.
Would you be in, like, there are alternatives where it's actually a community first response?
Yeah.
Would you be open to looking at that as opposed to because you said we have to get the police to do less. But when they're given the opportunity, they still kind of hang on.
I know. Yeah, it's funny actually because I used to work, like when I was a kid, I used to do a drop-in center. I worked for the city actually when I was a kid. And the police service actually came in and took that drop-in center over too. And I wasn't super happy with the way that was laid out back then because I thought we had a good situation. But yes, I would definitely be open to that. And I think that, I think the police service would be too. Right, so it's the reason why I think it's important to have in this situation to have a police officer paired with a social worker is because there are at least 50% of the calls that they can escalate into some form of violence, and so it's not necessary. I don't think it's a safe situation to be sending people who are in the social work field to some calls when it may escalate into something that could be harmful for them. So I would be definitely open to that and would love to have a future conversation on that. Yeah, definitely.